Continuing the chapter on the origins of life, one of my stories. Single-celled organisms don't leave a lot of good fossils. I mean, given the number of fossil beds that date back billions of years are pretty limited, but then looking in them to try to figure out what, there's no teeth, there's no shells, there's no hard parts. So that's somewhat frustrating. This is a depiction of life long ago, including these things, these kind of blobby looking things. Those are called Stromatolites. And their discoveries, interesting story. Geologist in Minnesota looking at these blobs from the surf zone of billions of years ago, trying to figure out how the heck these mineralized blobs were forming in the working surf. Is that he couldn't come up with any mechanism to precipitate the minerals out at all, let alone in these particular shapes. So he was stuck. He went on vacation. Decided, I'm gonna go snorkeling in Australia, on the Great Barrier Reef. And so he's got his stuff, in his little Speedos. Don't try to imagine me that way. Getting ready to go. He got his flippers, got his snorkel, and he's working into the surf, and he's stepping over these things. They're not just billions of years old. They still exist today. And so he started to talk to local people and local experts and found out these are collections of bacteria that clump together, pull minerals out of the water, and form this blob, this protective blob, not exactly the way the corals do, but functionally similar to what a coral does in order to pull minerals from the water and give themselves a casing. So these things that he was looking at from billions of years ago were direct evidence of prokaryote life from a long time ago. Now locally, we have these fossil outcrops. If you go to Saratoga, go up Route 29, there's a street that's Petrified Gardens, I think, Petrified Gardens Road. And the Petrified Gardens are stromatolites and other fossil layers from, so far back that there's nothing terribly dramatic there. It's interesting if you know the story, but, no dinosaur bones or stuff like that. Or if they do have dinosaur bones, they're not out of those layers. I haven't actually visited them, so I don't know exactly what they have. But stromatolites. Stromatolites. S-T-R-O-M, atolites. So these prokaryotic fossils go back a little bit further. Here's your basic split off to bacteria, archaea. Remember, these may be more closely related than we thought, and they may wind up in the same domain again, as opposed to being in the domain over here. Get your protists, algae, and your land plants, your more advanced plants, your funguses, and your animals. Notice animals and funguses are branch off after the plants branch off. And this is 2.5 billion years, 1.5 billion years, 500 million years. You'll notice the animals are fairly new to the party. For a long time, there was hardly a hint of animal fossils before a period called the Cambrian. And the fossil layers for the Cambrian had lots of animals. Animals of basically representing every modern phylum, but I think one little one. This one is life in the primordial soup, so that actually is not accurate, but it says, Earl, something's out there. And it's got a backbone and a complete digestive system. tube digestive system is considered a complete digestive system in some of the older books. But these, these are jellyfish. They don't read the books. How would they know? Really good bed of Cambrian fossils in Canada, just above Montana, in Washington, somewhere in there. The Burgess Shale, they call it. And when you go through it, it was a very shallow sea or sea inlet. So it had some pretty anoxic, low oxygen areas. And when you get that, the sediments tend to get very smooth and glassy, and they not only will preserve hard parts, they'll also sometimes mold around things. But you get hard parts. Suddenly, in the Cambrian, there's fossils of all of these different animals that leave hard parts, including some weird ones that they're still having trouble connecting to the groups that exist today. That sudden appearance of animals was called the Cambrian Explosion. And it almost looked like a poof moment. I mean, true, 40 to 80 million years, not poof, but nothing, and then suddenly all sorts of animals. And nobody could really explain why for a couple billion years nothing really happened, and then suddenly there was a tremendous amount of evolutionary change. Now we get to another story. Another geologist looking at sediments of Precambrian Earth, so before this, back a ways, not a huge ways, but a little bit. And he saw stuff in the sedimentary rock that he recognized, big foreign boulders in what would have been ocean sediments of the time. And uniformitarianism, he said, okay, if I was looking at modern sediment, I know what I'm looking at. This is a berg drop, an iceberg drop. As glaciers, like giant plows, come across the continents, and as they push through, they tend to pull large boulders up inside the ice and carry them along. You go up into the woods around here, you see glacier drops. When the glaciers retreated, they dropped these rocks a long way from where they picked them up. Well, if the glacier happens to make it to the ocean and icebergs drop off of it, the icebergs also carry these giant rocks, sometimes huge, but decent sized rocks. And they carry them until the ice melts and the rocks drop into the sediment as a very foreign inclusion in the sediment. And he's looking at this going, okay, that's weird. I'm looking at rocks from the equator. You don't get icebergs to the equator. They melt long before they get to the equator. Must have been pretty doggone cold for this to be true. And he published on this suggesting that there was a major ice age before the Cambrian. To which people, as they often do, went, oh, you're nuts. Is that the continents are moving around. These sediments may be on the equator now, but they weren't on the equator then. They were somewhere colder. And so he had to go back to the research drawing board. And it turns out that when sediments settle in the oceans, there are small magnetic particles in the sediments. And they orient according to the direction of the magnetic field that comes out of the North and South Pole and then goes across this way. Well, if you're close to the pole, the sediments orient this way as they settle. Is that as you get farther out, they settle at a different angle. And if you're at the equator, they settle pretty much even up. That's the way that the magnetic particles were in these sediments. So he was able to publish again and go, no, look, these things were on the equator. And then, as often happens, people went, oh, okay. That explains a bunch of stuff we couldn't explain before, where the actual sedimentation rate had slowed way down through a long period of time going into the Cambrian. Well, of course, if you have an ice age, you don't get anywhere near as much runoff from the ocean, so you don't get the sediment accumulation that you would get. And now people really started to dig into this. And they actually gave it, because we're American and this is what we do, gave it the name Snowball Earth, or the Snowball Period, because the Earth, they figured out, literally froze as a planet. Is that late into this, the oceans were frozen at the equator. No more icebergs, just frozen, maybe down as much as half a kilometer. So not all the way to the bottom. And in some of the surf zones, probably not. In any place that there were hydrothermal vents, probably not. Well, almost definitely not, because you had heat. But it would have taken the living space that all of these primitive eukaryotes had gotten used to and reduced it to some very limited real estate. You know what that does? It ratchets up the competition for resources. And predators get better, defenses against predators get better. It's a humongous change in conditions that can be a huge driver of much faster evolution. So now there was an explanation for where these guys came from. Various places around the planet, they had evolved in response to the reduction of real estate. By the time you get to this location, the snowball period had been over for a while, but it may have taken quite a while for the animals to spread back out across the warming Earth. Volcanic gases eventually form a greenhouse effect, like we're doing with our emissions, and warm the Earth back up. And then these guys spread out from there. In the meantime, I mentioned we had eukaryotes, right? Bigger cells, membrane inclusions. Some membrane inclusions actually were kidnap victims. We talked about that. Mitochondria, chloroplasts. Big innovation, homologous chromosomes, paired chromosomes, which allow mixing and matching and sexual reproduction. Even single-celled organisms engage in sexual reproduction. So much more evolutionary potential. Then then colonialism, and then multicellularity. Remember, prokaryotes, not so good at multicellularity. Eukaryotes, rather than get big, they start to split the jobs up amongst a collection of cells. And so now we have recognizable to modern life in the oceans. And it's in the oceans for quite a while. There's continents, but not that hospitable up in the land. But somebody's got to go after the baseball or take the dare. These are labeled great moments in evolution. There's a lot of light up there, good for plants. But there were issues of that were very difficult if you've evolved in the water to exist in the air. But what if you were kind of on the way? Because you'd already adapted to certain challenges that translated to the air. It's thought that there were two major staging areas from which aquatic living things moved to becoming terrestrial living things, living on the land. Those were tidal pools. You know, tide goes in, tide goes out. Used to be more of them. The moon's actually getting farther away. It used to be closer. The tides used to be bigger. Tidal pools and the outflow from, you know, there would have been weather, there would have been rain, there would have been rivers, there would have been outflow to the oceans. And fast flowing fresh water was another staging area for movement of life onto the land. Why? Well, okay, think about what you have to do to be out of the water. You have to support yourself and be able to move around. Tidal zones, the plants need to be able to kind of hang on and give themselves some structure to resist the movement of the waves. Animals need to be able to scurry from pool to pool as their pools dry up. Fresh water, as it gets shallow, being able to scurry and resist the flow of the water, move around. All of those are precursors to being able to support yourself in the air. So that's one thing now. Obviously, the air is drier than the water. But when we talked about osmosis, we talked about animals adapting to fresh water by either having casings, well, not just animals, but organisms adapting to fresh water. They had casings around their cells that protected the cells from swelling up too much with the water. That's a structural element. It can be adjusted to be somewhat waterproof. If you're an animal and you are largely waterproof, like our fishy ancestors were in fresh water, that not only keeps the water from flowing in through osmosis, it keeps your internal water from flowing out into the air. You live in a tidal pool, they dry up, it rains into them, you better be able to deal with pretty decent fluctuations of water and keep from losing water when you don't want to lose water. So another thing. Sunlight. The electromagnetic radiation in sunlight can mess with a lot of molecules. Water tends to absorb and reflect a lot of that, unless you're really close to the surface, or in the air. But in a tidal pool, you're really close to the surface. In shallow fresh water, you're really close to the surface. So your chemistry is better be able to deal with direct sunlight in order to live in those two areas. And then you're kind of preset to be able to move into the air at some point. I'm going through the list in my head here. Oxygen, it turns out, has been being cranked out by plants for millions and millions of years. Oxygen has limited dissolvability in water, but it's much more friable in air. So while the water had kind of stabilized with a certain amount of oxygen available for aerobic organisms, the air had a lot more oxygen, still does. Much, much more oxygen in the air than is dissolved in any of the oceans or the fresh water. But that's an issue. Remember, oxygen is very reactive. So organisms needed to be able to deal with that higher level of reactive oxygen. But the thing is, using that reactivity can actually give you more energy to deal with. You can actually run a higher metabolism with that much more oxygen. And that's basically what land animals wound up doing, is that their metabolisms adjusted to the, over time, out and back, out and back, out and back, adjusted to being first resisting the effects of the high levels of oxygen and then putting it to use. This is why terrestrial animals, groups that have gone back into the water, like the crocodilians or the penguins or the whales, they don't breathe water. Not enough oxygen in the water to support their high terrestrial metabolisms. They have to come to the surface and breathe. The only time they can survive in the water is if they're doing basically nothing, which some terrestrial animals hibernate under the water in the sediments, but they are dormant. They're not active. When the ice is gone, they come up to the surface and breathe in order to be active, like turtles and frogs, things like that. Another thing that happens in the air that doesn't happen as much in water, you can change the temperature of these gases much quicker than you can change water. The more water, the harder it is to because of the hydrogen bonds of the water, it absorbs heat really easily and it doesn't lose heat that quickly. Things that live in the deeper water, you get a certain distance down in the water in the oceans, it's 4 degrees Celsius. That's pretty much it everywhere. It's that cold everywhere. And close to the surface, you don't get as much fluctuation. But you do in tidal pools, and you do in freshwater where rain picks up the temperature of the atmosphere and converts it into the outflow. So again, if you could deal with tidal pool temperature changes and freshwater temperature changes, you could kind of deal with air temperature changes. Now, most of the first invaders, what they call the pioneer organisms, probably this happened at the equator in areas that were very rainy and humid, so the difference was not as stark and the temperature fluctuations were not as big, and you kind of go from there. And then you remember from last semester, reproduction turned out to be the hardest issue to deal with These are organisms that depended on ambient water for sperm to get to the egg cells. And getting up onto the land, they don't fly too well. So your mosses and your ferns in the plant area stayed tied to open surface water for sexual reproduction. They went to the alternation of generations where the asexual forms could be dispersal forms, but their reproductive forms were kind of locked in to open water. Animals, your arthropods, internal fertilization had already been well established in arthropods, so the sperm swam inside the females to a large extent. Some sort of transfer was happening. In our ancestors, the amphibians are still tied to open water for reproduction, is it took the development of internal fertilization and also a sealed, waterproof, breathable egg in the reptiles to be able to get our ancestors into being full-time terrestrial organisms. Okay, I'm going to go a little long on this because I want to get this last part in here. Suddenly, Bobby felt very alone in the world. All the signs say extinct. Sorry, extinct. Every once in a while, if you're looking at the fossil layers, all of the species in this older layer, half of them at least are gone in the next layer up. That qualifies as a mass extinction. Half of the fossilized species are gone in the next newer layer. Sometimes it's more than that. The Permian extinction, it was over 95% disappearance. That's when the trilobites went away. Why? What causes mass extinctions? Well, the simple answer is something clears out the bottom of the food chain. That's your common thread. Take out the plants, you take out most of the animals. And so all of the different causes of mass extinctions are a way to mess with the photosynthetic, the producers. Ice ages do that. Cool everything down, cover everything with snow and ice, the plants don't do very well. Anything that releases huge amounts of dust into the atmosphere, impact of an asteroid, huge volcanic eruptions. And in the past, there have been volcanic eruptions. Most of India was volcanoes at one period for, I think, the Jurassic to Cretaceous extinction. Astronomical events that throw a huge amount of nasty radiation in our direction. Might just not be killing the plants, but everything with that. That's been suggested for the Permian extinction. No tremendous evidence for that. It's more of a lack of evidence for some of the other causes for the Permian extinction, but it's on the list of things that could cause an extinction, whether it ever has or not. You get a neutron star collapse or a supernova in the general vicinity, as in within like 20 or 30 light years of us, and we could get caught in the spill out of the radiation. It has been suggested that the sun might have a dark companion, a dwarf star, brown dwarf, nobody knows. Is it, they call it Nemesis, and people have hypothesized that it's on a long elliptical path that brings it not in all that close, not even in as close as Pluto, but somewhere out beyond the range of edge of Pluto, about every 26 million years. Because if you look at the fossil record, the mass extinctions happen approximately every 26 million years. And the theory is it gets close enough. Now out beyond Pluto, there's a lot of rocks happily going around at a great distance from the sun. But you gravitationally disturb them, and you can toss them in at the inner solar system. And some of them can hit the Earth in the process. So Nemesis is a theorized rock thrower, basically. But the evidence for it is iffy. Is that I've been watching, for a while they were pretty sure that they'd found enough evidence that it didn't exist. And then a couple of years later, it came back up again. I'm not really sure why. I'm not really sure what evidence was starting to swing the possibilities the other way. There's a lot of gravitational simulation stuff that people do with the outer solar system. It's very tricky to pull together. One thing that is not a cause of mass extinctions, so when you hear this come up on lists, because people don't know what they're talking about, this is sometimes on the list. Disease is never going to be a mass extinction apparatus. It can make species go extinct. It can make related species go extinct. But it can't clear out all the plants, and it definitely can't clear out all the animals, because diseases are not that generic. They don't hit wide swaths of different species all at once. So you just don't have the potential there. Also keep in mind that diseases are in the business of surviving. They get into a host, they spread their offspring. That's usually better accomplished if they don't kill their host right away. So evolution of diseases, when they jump from one organism to another and are maybe not that good at living there, make them really sick, kill them. The strains that are more successful at not killing them, at not making them all that sick, much more successful at getting their offspring spread to new hosts. So diseases tend to become less nasty pretty quickly when they jump from one species to another, because that's their survival mechanism. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but again, they just don't infect that many different organisms all at once. Continental drift factors into this. Ice ages are a result of that, because as the continents are related to one another, it changes the circulation of heat and moisture in the atmosphere, and that can do, you know, a lot of very strange things in terms of producing possibly the Snowball Period, is that there was like one big continent during the Snowball Period. They think that's connected. Okay, that's it for this chapter.